Thank my friend for yielding, and I want to continue where my friend from California, Mr. Herger, left off, talking about what kind of times brought Ronald Reagan here to Washington. I mean, when we're told today that we face the worst economy since the Great Depression, there are a lot of us remember an even worse time when we did have double-digit unemployment and double-digit inflation and mile-long lines around gas stations and interest rates that exceeded 20%. And by the way, when we hear that our world's growing more dangerous by the day, I remember when an American embassy could be seized with impunity, when an aggressive and expanding Soviet Union daily challenged American interests around the world, when communism went unchallenged in the Western Hemisphere, when the American military had been so badly weakened it couldn't even launch a successful rescue mission. Perhaps we don't remember those days as vividly because they didn't last very long. At that dark hour in our nation's history, the American people turned to Ronald Reagan, who diagnosed our country's problems very accurately. In this crisis, he said, government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. He said the Soviet Union is indeed an evil empire, and it was time, he said, that America stopped apologizing for its interests and started asserting them. At the time, the American left excoriated Reagan. They warned that his policies would lead the nation to starvation and the world to conflagration. Instead, we enjoyed a period of American prosperity and world influence that was best described with the words, morning again in America. He reduced the tax and regulatory burdens that were crushing America's economy. He reduced government spending as a percentage of GDP. He restored America's military strength, reasserted American interests around the world. He stopped apologizing for America's greatness and started celebrating it. It was recalled earlier in his farewell address, Reagan attributed his success not to being a great communicator, but to the fact that he was communicating great ideas, the self-evident truths of the American founding. He did one other thing. He restored those self-evident truths as the foundation of our domestic and foreign policy. And as a result, our nation prospered and the world enjoyed a rebirth of freedom. Unfortunately, Reagan's successors gradually abandoned his policies, and Americans gradually let loose of those self-evident truths that inspired and animated those policies. But now, as our nation endures prolonged economic distress at home and increasing strife abroad, Americans are beginning to realize that our nation hasn't been struck down by some mysterious act of God. What's happened to our country is because of specific acts of government. And as Reagan knew, acts of government are fully within our power to change. Reagan charted the road back. Our nation followed him down that road, and we discovered that, yes, it does indeed lead to a shining city on a hill. As we remember Ronald Reagan, all that he was and all that he stood for, let's also remember what he did and where he led us. It isn't too late to return to those policies and get back on that road. Mr. Speaker, I want my children to know what morning again in America actually feels like. I want them to know the optimism that America's best days are yet ahead, and to know the pride and confidence of American exceptionalism. On this centennial of Ronald Reagan's birth, let's not just remember him, let's follow his example and get our nation back on the road to freedom. And let those looking back on our generation say that just when it began to appear that our nation had forgotten Ronald Reagan and squandered its wealth and abandoned its destiny and forsaken its founding principles, this generation of Americans rediscovered, restored, and revived the memory of Ronald Reagan and the promise of the American founding, and that from that moment in time, America began her next great era of expansion, prosperity, and influence.